You're very welcome. It's episode 77 of The Shortlist. My name is Johnny Campbell. I'm your host for this podcast and live show, which broadcasts every Wednesday on LinkedIn and YouTube. For those of us joining us live, you're very welcome. We really appreciate your comments and questions as we go through the show. And this week, we're going to be talking about an untapped pool of diverse talent, the unemployed. But before we get into that, it's Wednesday, the 24th of November. We're heading towards the end of 2021. The pandemic is beginning to rage. And as I'm broadcasting here from Dublin, Ireland, apparently Europe is at the epicenter of this next wave. In fact, in the Campbell household, we've had my eldest son of 13 in quarantine for the last 10 days as he got COVID, and thankfully the rest of us didn't. And he's been isolated in his bedroom and comes out tonight and passes his 10 days. And that's a story, unfortunately, that many of us are living through again as the pandemic surges and rages in Europe and probably the rest of the world if it hasn't hit those same numbers. So we're still talking about this unique world that's been driven by the pandemic. And we want to talk today about kind of the culmination of what's been called the Great Resignation, which we've talked about on the show in many weeks, combining that with elements of diversity and inclusion and how certain populations are marginalized, right? And it's always, of course, important to be on the lookout for underutilized sources of talent. That's what the recruiting and talent acquisition industry tries to do. And given how competitive the market is, being able to attract star candidates is going to be a huge boon for any organization. And of course, that's the dream. But there's one pool that often gets overlooked and is often very much not talked about or forgotten, and that's the unemployed, right? And with an unemployment rate of around 7% in the EU right now, this offers, we think, a huge opportunity for companies to find really amazing employees. And when you look at the fact that minority groups typically are overrepresented amongst the unemployed, it's perhaps also a great opportunity to go find a diverse and creative group of people to attract. So to kind of tackle this topic and join us today, we have someone who not only holds this cause very closely to his heart, Colin Donnery. Colin is the incoming Group Chief Executive of the FRS Network, which is a cooperative social enterprise with subsidiaries in the recruitment, training, and agricultural sectors. So he runs a recruitment agency here in Ireland, but he's also the founder and director of Turas Nua, which, for those of you not in Ireland, which I know is most of you, is the leading provider of employability services to help the unemployed get back into the workforce. So working on behalf of the government of Ireland to help the unemployed and long-term unemployed get back to work. So it's a really unique perspective Colin has. In one hand, running a recruitment agency that is being paid by employers to find talent, and the other half are running are part of an organization that is trying to get the long-term unemployed back to work. I think it's one of those most unique perspectives perhaps in the world in this talent space. And I want to have a conversation with Colin today about how important it is to build confidence in the unemployed, how that vital service is empowering a sector of society back into positions of employment, why this service is going to become more important perhaps in this evolving world of work. Colin, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us today. And you might start by telling us where you're joining us from, because it's not Ireland, is it?
Hey, Johnny, how are you? Great to see you. I'm in Florence, and if you look up at the ceiling there in the sort of place I'm staying, you can sort of tell it's sort of an amazing place to be. I'm here just on a bit of a holiday, so just literally got off a train, jumped on and ran here to get to talk to you, which is great. Delighted to be here. So.
And Colin, can you maybe introduce FRS on one side? Just tell us a little bit about the size of FRS, the focus of recruiting you do there, the teams, and then a little bit about Turas Nua and that perspective. And maybe you might mention your involvement in the wider kind of recruiting bodies across Europe and the global network. Because I think I want to just stress it's not just an Irish perspective you have on this.
Yeah, sure. So, well, FRS we're a cooperative, first of all. So set up in 1980. We started off, I suppose, supporting farmers in Ireland, so it's a really unique sort of story. In the 80s, and then naturally we moved into the recruitment sector. So we had people, specialists on farms, and then organizations came to us and goes, can you get us people for, sort of driving and, warehousing and retail. And, we've since built up one of the largest recruitment companies in Ireland, FRS Recruitment. we've diversified into many different areas. So we have a large training company as well. We've actually one of the fastest growing agri-tech businesses in the world now, called Herdwatch. We've over 15,000 farmers between Ireland and the UK use it, and that's really for another day. When you drive down the motorway here, when you see fences at the side of the road, we erect those sort of fences, and we do lots of weird and sort of wonderful stuff. So back in 2013-14, after the last major recession, I was president of the National Recruitment Federation, and we've been sort of talking to the government about how we could help, I suppose, the unemployed. Just to give you an example, we had over 17% unemployment in Ireland at the time. We had a catastrophic construction boom and deterioration after that boom, which just devastated the country here, much more so probably than most other countries after the last major recession. So in order to, I suppose, support people back into employment, we set up an organization called Turas Nua, which is a Gaelic term, and it means new journey. We employ just under 300 people in that business across 40 offices. And I suppose we started really in early 2016. So we've had approximately 150,000 unemployed people through the door since then. So it's quite a large number for Ireland, maybe not for other places, but and we basically keep those people on a program for a whole year. And support them, help them back into employment across all sectors, across every type of customer background, every every type of role. So literally we see everyone coming through the door, and I can talk to you a bit about how we sort of do that, as well, if you like.
Well, let me come to that. I want to start off, Colin, with a recent news article that came out in the Washington Post, and this was published early this month. And the headline from the Post was "Why Millions of Job Seekers Aren't Getting Hired in This Hot Job Market." And I want to maybe ask you for your perspective on this, having, of course, one foot in the recruiting world where you're trying to service the employers in this hot job market, right? And then the other foot in the market for trying to get the unemployed back to work, right? The article is quite detailed. We'll share the links in the footnotes of the podcast and live as well here. A really detailed article that gives plenty of examples of workers, and it's a US, obviously, centric article, in different industries, workers in different industries who, for various reasons, are finding it very difficult to get back into the job market. And they're trying to highlight this disconnect between that perspective, folks who are perhaps working in the bar industry, hospitality industry, retail industry, service industry, who can't find jobs, versus the employers who can't find talent. And, in the US, it highlights, I think, a gap where there's something like 10 million vacancies advertised and there's 7 million unemployed. So it kind of highlights the fact that there's more jobs available than there are people to do the jobs, yet people are still finding it difficult to find a job. I wonder if you could share your insights as to, from your perspective in the Irish market, have you seen something similar? And if so, what are your thoughts on some of the reasons why there is a disconnect between demand and supply?
So I think the first thing, obviously, we're in a sort of a unique sort of period in time of hiring. We had this sort of situation where we had sort of a sharp shock, actually quite similar in a way to after September the 11th, when we had this sharp shock of companies just stopped hiring, right? And a similar thing happened last year in April 2020. So we saw this sort of, the brakes were put on for a number of months, and really organizations really didn't know what was going to happen, and workers really didn't know what was going to happen. So a number of sectors got really badly hit, as we know, the sort of retail, and particularly hospitality, restaurants, fast food, all those sort of industries really got hit really, really quick and really, really hard. And people within those industries effectively were, in Ireland and the UK and other areas, they were put on support payments in most areas, and in the States as well. And I think what we've seen on the worker side is that people have really begun to think about what they're doing in their job. and what it means to work, and I, like and how I suppose the pandemic has affected them personally. And I suppose governments around the world put in a lot of supports. And I think what we're seeing is, in a lot of cases, is people are really starting to think about where they're going to go back to work, right? So, and if we look at what has happened in the States, particularly in the last 6 months, particularly in hospitality, they found it very difficult to attract people back into the business. So, what traditionally happened in the US, it was a tips type culture, so very, very low salaries, and you built it up with tips. And what we've seen with a lot of the major sort of chains in the States have increased their salaries exponentially, like untold of, like from $10 to $15, 50% increases in salaries, and they're still finding it difficult to get those people back into those jobs. And I think it's potentially a disconnect of purpose, right? So, and we've heard, and purpose gets a lot of talk, and particularly over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, organizations, this is our purpose, and but I think workers now, regardless of the level they're at or the job they're in, are really looking for purpose that connects with the organizations they work for, and two, actually, what's their purpose and what's the organization doing for them, which particularly around growth, learning, and developing, and that type of thing. And I think traditionally organizations have looked at people coming in and saying, well, we'll keep these people for 3 or 4 years or 5 years at that level. And I think that's real one area that we've seen a real push back. And I think on the other side, organizations who are really struggling for talent in other areas, we'll say like call centers and, I suppose office type roles, looking a little bit sort of snobbily is the wrong word, but, looking at these workers from retail and hospitality and thinking, are they right for our organization? Do they have the skills, etc.? So I think that's the sort of disconnect we're sort of seeing on the ground. But actually, since I suppose particularly the last 4 or 5 months, on both sides of our recruitment business and in Turas Nua, unemployed people now are seen as almost a precious commodity to come in, because I think organizations are starting to look at them differently. There has, I think traditionally there's always been this sort of employers not really, it's looked upon as, a couple of years ago, it was big CSR thing. Let's hire some unemployed people, and, it can help with our CSR. We're doing good for the community, etc. But I think what's happening now is organizations are starting to really see that these people have lived experiences. And actually, if you invest in them and train them and bring them through your organization, they actually become more loyal potentially than the employees you already have in the organization.
One of the things the article called out, Colin, which I thought was really interesting, I hadn't thought about before, was the use of technology in sifting through job applications. And maybe this is more about the direct hiring organizations. The article suggests that something like 90% of hiring companies have some sort of technology screening, automated screening in the applications, and that those bots or algorithms are matching keywords and matching experience. So if you're on and perhaps discounting folks who have a gap, who haven't worked in X amount of months or years, and I suggest that part of the challenge isn't down to the human element around, will you give these people a chance? Do you think it's part of your culture? Part of it's down to just the tech, weeds them out before they even get to a real person. How much evidence have you seen of that kind of an effect, or do you think there is an effect around the tech in the first instance?
So I think there's a dual thing going on, right? One, on the employer side, certainly. The problem is, I think employers are looking for very specific things and skills, right? So, we all say, oh, we're hiring, we're hiring for for talent and attitude, but actually we're not. Do you know what I mean? So the more when you put in a chatbot and someone has to answer 50 questions and run through their previous experience and skills, you're building up a profile of that person. If they have a gap on their CV, if they're unemployed for a year, it's seen as a negative. If they haven't worked for 2 years or 3 years, it's seen it's really seen as a negative, and they don't get through that process. On the unemployed side, and we see it with a lot of unemployed people. And I have actually an example of it recently, of someone coming from retail who doesn't have really great IT skills, right? So when you put them through that process, one, it's not a great experience for them, because it's quite an anxiety-inducing sort of process. Now, you might say, well, it's just going through a chatbot, but they're looking to, if you're not, really confident in that whole area of working with tech and that, it sort of turns you off. So a lot of unemployed people don't make it past the actual logging in, and then when they get in there, it's like, how do I get here? And you know what I mean? And it's all a bit of a mess for them, So I do think, and the bias thing, I don't know whether you remember it, Johnny, but and the viewers, some of them might, maybe they won't sort of remember this type of thing, but when in the 80s, when I came from Northside Dublin, and in it was an okay neighborhood, but it wasn't a great neighborhood, and she said, oh, why don't you put your auntie's address on that job application? Do you know what I mean? And that's the sort of thing unemployed people feel they have to do. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's sort of, put a sheet over it and pretend they come from different areas and that type of thing, because they feel potentially employers, will look at them in a negative way, depending on where they come from or their circumstances, and that's still the case. You know what I mean? There's I suppose an unseen bias sometimes there. You know what I mean? And it's, but I think we're starting to see really in Turas Nua organizations, that we work with, really starting to look at the unemployed sort of cohort of people, and seeing that, bloody hell, these people do actually give us a real source of great talent, great workers, hard workers, etc. So.
I want to come back to some of the points in that Washington Post article in a second, but you mentioned confidence. So that brings me, I want to share the next news article we can cover it from the last week or so, which was in Yahoo Finance, and it's UK specific, and talking about unemployment inequality is adding to the UK's dire labour shortage. And this article points to some of the comments you just made there, Colin, which was around that individuals from, as it defines, lower socioeconomic backgrounds and the long-term unemployed tend to apply to less jobs, have less confidence in writing a CV, less confidence in doing an interview. So you touched on that, with the example of the chatbot as one example. When you look at the Turas Nua work that you've been involved in the last 5-6 years, how important is it to build up someone's confidence in all of those elements, and what works to do that?
Okay, so this is it's such, I'm passionate about this area. I've read this book twice. I don't know whether you can see it here. It's called How Confidence Works by Ian Robertson. He's a professor in Trinity College, Dublin. Everyone should read this book, right? So effectively, what we do, so when someone comes to us in Turas Nua and they're unemployed, we don't just sit down and have a chat with them, right? So we do an assessment. We developed an assessment with the University of Sheffield Hallam back now 6 years ago, and so we look at their distance from the labour market across about 10 measures, right? So skills, mental health, health, child caring, either whether that be for a senior or for a child, transport, and confidence. So we measure confidence, and it's probably the critical building block for, and I'll come on to people in the workplace in a minute, but in terms of an unemployed person, right? So without confidence, effectively, what you've mentioned there about them not applying for jobs happens. And it's this sort of, circular and sort of thing that happens to them, where they find it really, really difficult to get out of it, and it is something that could be worked on. So once we do the assessment, so we look at it, and then we look at the barriers, and we deal with things, like to be drugs and alcohol, we look at that and how we can help. Can we refer them to to local specialists? If there's serious mental health problems, we get them talking to people in the health sector in Ireland. And then we start working, on skills, and as we work on all these different things, and I suppose the number one thing is that they have to believe we're invested in them, right? So that's really critical. And if you walk into one of our offices, it's a totally different sort of environment than an unemployed person is used to walking into. They're not walking into a sort of a glass screen, as I used to call them, bulletproof screens with someone to advise them sitting behind it. They're sitting down beside their personal advisor who's working through this, I suppose, the challenges they have. And one of the things in Ian Robertson's book, which is really interesting, and we've absolutely found, is, you've got to give a sort of a sense of hope and direction first before you take on the challenges. It's really critical that there those barriers, and that's done through, I suppose, the look and feel of our offices. I suppose the great people we have working for us across our 40 offices. And then it's about working on those sort of challenges. And as we do that, their confidence builds, right? And I suppose the funny thing is, sometimes people come to us, and what we notice is, so we have them on program for 12 months. And what we notice is there is sometimes they get a job too quick, right? So one of the things we've got to get them to do is, look, when you're unemployed, you're out of the habit of work. And it's a habit. It's getting up in the morning, it's getting washed, getting clothes on that you feel good in. And, that's really part of it. You know what I mean? And it's, I suppose, people, who've been unemployed for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, and I was trying to think of a situation. Look, when I read the book, before I read the book, I was I'm a naturally confident person, I think, and you're probably naturally confident. And I was trying to get to a situation, but there's things you've really got to work on. And I was trying to put myself in a place where, when am I not confident? And I don't know whether you noticed this, right? But if you ever wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning, or 4 a.m., and your brain goes to the darkest place all the time of the negatives, do you know that sort of feeling, right? Where it's like, what's going to happen? And this is going really wrong. And how am I going to fix this? And this thing goes on, right? And if you imagine an unemployed person is like that all the time.
The fear all the time.
All the time. All day, every day, of this, how am I going to get over this? You know what I mean? And really, in the same way as you and I and everyone else that's, has a lot of confidence in what they're doing, is you get over that by dealing with the issue. You know what I mean? So it's like, not really forgetting about the issue and moving on. It's about actually, challenging yourself to actually have these expectations of yourself. So you sort of get this sort of path of where you think you can go, and then you sort of take the barriers away one by one. So I suppose what we do then is really, it's about putting those opportunities in front of people, But it's interesting. Confidence really works when people, overconfidence and this type of thing of having, I'm gonna fly to the moon, I'm gonna be an astronaut, etc. If people over pitch on that, it tends to backfire. Do you know what I mean? Because what happens is they don't reach it. They don't reach those sort of roles that they think they're going to get in. So it's about expectation and setting the bar at a sort of a little bit of a stretch to get there. And I know I'm sort of talking here a little bit, going on a bit, but
no. Yeah. If I can give you my perspective, I heard an article. Sorry, someone was on the radio in the last week in Ireland, and they were talking about this topic, because they were talking about how people talk about have a positive mental attitude, right? And I've always hated that, right? I'm a positive person like you, but it's like, it's dismissive. It's like, oh, you just need to be positive, have a positive mental attitude. I've never believed it worked, but I've never had the science. Somebody came on and they looked, done the research and said, listen, it doesn't work. But what does work, and maybe this is akin to what you're saying, Colin, is being realistic. And that somebody who is struggling with this, if you say, for example, listen, someone like you, 76% of the time can get a job in this. That's the fact. They go, oh, okay, that's a fact. It's not saying you can do anything you want from here and you can be amazing, you can be a millionaire tomorrow, which is just mental because it's just so far removed from reality. It's saying don't have a positive mental attitude, have a realistic attitude, because
Exactly. Yeah.
when you're full of that fear and doubt, you make up stuff that's not true probably. Whereas if you can focus on, here's the thing that's actually true, and I could do that, and here's evidence of it, that allows someone to build the confidence back to, okay, maybe I'll give it a go. Whereas if you go with the whole crazy, you can do anything PMA type attitude,
Yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
actually it backfires, to your point.
So what we do then, so if you think about it, these people at the moment we have, I don't know, we've about 15,000 people on program at the moment. 15,000 unemployed people, 1 year plus unemployed. So we people with 20 years unemployed, 15 years unemployed, 10 years unemployed. So what happens is our personal advisors are working with them closely on building the plan, right? And then it's about, them agreeing, yeah, this is a good plan. You know what I mean? So, and then we use some tech in terms of learning and that, and we've got a tutor team that sits in there. So one of the key things, particularly in it really works well in certain areas with youth unemployment, is peer learning, right? And basically getting people together. We've done things over the years where we get that youth unemployed cohort together, and the cohort's a bad word, isn't it? But those youth unemployed people
No, it's okay.
together, and we bring them to great employers, right? And we bring them in the door. We've been in some of the biggest they're multinational organizations in Ireland, and you bring them in and you walk them around, and they go, "This is like a different world." Do you know what I mean? And organizations have been really good to us. Some of the big US multinationals and Irish organizations let us in the door and show these people what's doable, and show them people who've actually, come up that sort of ladder, of success
Mm,
from diverse backgrounds. Do you know what I mean?
mm,
And and I think one of the things in that book I was talking about is really one of the key things is that we see it with kids, right? So we all know Johnny Campbell's kids think he's a billionaire, sort of built this company and everything's been fantastic. Do you know what I mean? But actually, look, I know you from 15 years ago, and you've challenges along the way and all those different challenges. So it's really important that we show people that this is normal. Like,
mm.
challenges come along and you overcome them. So the tutor team really work on that. We've about 20 tutors that we take them. It's obviously that's been one of the big challenges in COVID. Like, getting people together in a room is very, very powerful, and it's been a challenge for us doing it over Teams and Zoom. But we've got there. I think this year about 160,000 training instances in the business, and it's just been great to see. So really what happens then is we have our employer services team, right? And they're what I would call the advocates for all our customers, all our unemployed customers, right? So they're like an internal recruitment team.
Mm.
So basically what they do is there's 30 people in that team, and they work with employers. But effectively, we don't just forward people onto jobs, right? So it's like we sort of sit in the middle and we make sure there's a match there. And one of the things we've actually started to do in the last couple of years is challenge employers. So it's sort of saying, look, this person coming to you, like we're looking for sustainable employment, right? And people that are
Mm.
able to stay in a job for a long time, not only stay in that job, grow out from that job. So we're challenging employers to say, look, what are you going to do with this person when they come in? The first thing is, this person hasn't maybe worked in 3 or 4 years or 5 years or longer. You're going to have to support them. Are
Mm.
you ready to support them? Like, if there's a bit of a challenge there or not? Like, if you're not, look, There's lots of, and that's where the economy has flipped, so employers now are willing to take on that challenge. And then it's, I suppose, a case, and it's just, look, we place 45,000 people into jobs, right? And it's a sort of a big number. It's a bonkers number. And you say to people, they go, well, like, what does that mean? And well, we found 45,000 people jobs, right? But it's really just the stories behind it. It's just been an amazing. We work with McDonald's, right? So we work with McDonald's all over the country, and we were looking for an employer sort of video, a couple of years ago, and we went down to a place called Carlow, which is in the Midlands in Ireland, into McDonald's, and we were interviewing the managers, and it was great. Like, oh, look, you get us great people, and it was a great story. And one of the things is, right, and we call it silent success, right? Like, no one who's unemployed that we get into a job wants to say Turas Nua gets them a job, right? Because it's almost like so our sort of, it's quite tricky for us. So it's trying to advocate for someone, but actually help them help themselves and get that job. So we went down to this McDonald's, and I said, can we interview, a couple of the people we placed here? And our government people were like, oh no, whoa, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, no, can we just talk to them? And they were like, oh, don't know about that. Like, he could leave in 6 weeks. And I said, well, who cares? Well, if you make a video and then someone comes back and says he left the job, I said, but they may leave. He may leave in 6 days. Like, but we just want to understand what's happened. So we got two people, a guy called Brian, who was 19, and a woman called Margaret, who was 50. And we just talked to them, just tell us, like, what was happening in your life, and Brian was 19. He didn't do well in school, didn't do great in his exams, and sort of dropped out. He'd been unemployed for 2 years, and probably had higher expectations than McDonald's, I think, as a job, and but we sort of convinced them, I think, that, look, you've got to get on the ladder here, you know what I mean? And then Margaret was a mother who, she'd had kids. She was, about early, I think it was about early 50s. And she talked to us about just feeling sort of left behind, not able to. So she'd lost confidence and didn't feel employers wanted to know her, and our guys work with her, and they did a great job. And we did this video, and it was like, tears all around, you know what I mean? But it was just a sense of satisfaction. And it was great for the employer. Like, McDonald's there it was a franchise, and they just were like, look, this is great, you know what I mean? And can we be doing more? So it was moving away from the whole CSR sort of, oh yeah, this is a box tick, you know what I mean, to and I suppose when you look at that diverse, as you mentioned at the start, that diverse set of like, young people, older people, ethnic minorities, women, that's who are the main, they're, as you say, they're overrepresented in the unemployed area. Do you know what I mean? And I think the thing is, like, one of the things we work with a great organization called Business to Arts. There's quite a lot of people within the sort of creative space as well in that cohort, and they come with a different sort of view on life and work and that type of thing. And I think, look, that whole sort of area around future work, it's going to become just so important that we have. I suppose as employers, we're an employer, we employ 2,500 people. We've really had to start looking differently at how we sort of look at people and workers and assess them, and what we're looking for, and how we actually help them through the process, instead of as you mentioned earlier, that chatbot sort of situation of ruling people out. Let's rule everyone in, you know what I mean, and then get through and find the best person for the job, and I suppose the best organization really for that person, I suppose.
I can't, and thank you, right? I think those stories are wonderful, right? It's marvelous to hear the success. 45,000 in an economy like Ireland is an enormous amount. Um, can I ask you, wearing that hat as an employer, and I'm glad you brought it up, for those listening to the show today, and who hopefully are moved by some of those stories and feel, yes, this is an area I've overlooked as a recruiter, as a hiring manager, as a head of talent before, what can organizations begin to do to open up their processes to more applicants from this kind of a community? What are the practical ways that you can begin to change those? What have organizations that work with Turas Nua done, and what are you trying to do with your organization?
So I think you've got to be purposeful about it first. Do you know what I mean? You've got to actually, set out a plan here. Just saying, oh, we're going to hire some unemployed people. You know what I mean? Because you've got to understand the impact it has on the organization when people come in. So there's lots of funding there to help people and help organizations with that sort of training, and it's not really about the training bit. It's sort of the welcoming bit, and it's the just, you're one of us sort of thing. You know what I mean? Not that you're this, oh my God, you're this unemployed, but and sometimes organizations overcompensate with this, and it's like, oh my God, you know what I mean? And it's, we gotta keep this. We really gotta help this person and whatever. I would say sometimes you gotta, if it's not working out, it's not working out. You know what I mean? The person isn't right for the job. Just, you don't try and force it either. But I think just being, I suppose, as I said, a little bit more doing things on purpose around identifying those sort of, minorities in your community, you know what I mean? Like whether that be New York or Boston or LA or, Munich, Frankfurt, Paris, Dublin, London, you know what I mean? And there's sources of and there's ways into this. So there's plenty of organizations like ours around the world that do this work every day. A lot of them really small organizations that we work with ourselves. And I suppose on the tech thing, I think a lot of the people we deal with on the unemployed side really aren't as tech savvy as you would think. They can use phones and obviously and that type of thing, but you're making them jump through hoops. You know what I mean? And like, I think someone was talking to us last week. I was in one of the offices, you know what I mean? And he was on a website for something like 45 minutes, and I'm going like, just make it simple, you know what I mean? A one-click apply, and that type of thing that really just makes it easy for them to get on board. And but it's, I don't think it's I think organizations have become savvy to this now, particularly in the last 6 months. They see this, really, like, we're inundated with, organizations and companies looking for people from us, from the unemployed cohort. And there's lots of different, as I said, funding streams and training and different things in there to help companies through that.
You reminded me, Colin, of a story that one of our presenters, Joanna Abai, who received an MBE for her work with diversity, inclusion, and equality in the UK. Only got her Queen's Medal last week, I think. She told a story of, again, coming from a socioeconomically disadvantaged background herself. And she talked about how employers often offer opportunities, again, with good intentions, for folks to perhaps do an apprenticeship or training. And many of them, and we've been guilty in social talent many years ago of doing this, training programs that are, you work for free to get the training. And it's like, get that up and running. Someone should be happy to get the training. And she points out, she said, what typically happens is you've somebody who's come from a more privileged background who understands their own perspective and tries to apply it to the market they're hiring from. She said, I came from a background where I couldn't afford to get to the job. So when someone says, we're giving you the opportunity to train and get experience, and, you do a work placement for free or very little, it's like, this person doesn't have these choices. And one of the articles, the Yahoo article we shared there, pointed that out, the difference between, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds can't travel as much, can't change location, don't have someone to support them to work for free or low while they build up skills or training. You're those from higher economic backgrounds who don't tend to be as unemployed can get support from families. Families will help them financially in all these different environments. It's again remembering these other things. To your point around changing the process, to go ask yourself, is this job opportunity that we're creating here really set up for somebody who is on the margins, who has been unemployed many, many years, doesn't have the same support network and structures and backgrounds? Are we really helping that person? Like, has that been your experience, that maybe employers with best intentions just don't have the right lens to really understand the market that they're hiring from?
Yeah, I think, look, I think the talent acquisition sort of community is starting to get the grips with this, but leaders within, organizations like C-suite and whatever can be a little bit detached, and I think, honestly, I think our community is really doing a great job in this whole area, and I definitely think they're looking at things potentially really through the, as you say, through the wrong lens, really, and I think as we progress with, look, and we talk about how people lose jobs, and obviously anyone can have a situation where they just, something going on in their personal life, it affects their job, they lose their job. Then you have the sort of automation of lots of jobs, and you see those 10 types of things, right, tend not to be revolution, they're evolution, right? So you don't sort of sit around and think, like, the revolution that has happened is COVID, right? But what's happening in the background is we're seeing huge amounts of automation of jobs, and so we're going to see lots more people moving into types of what I would call maybe underemployment and unemployment, who wouldn't necessarily have been there before, and over look, we all know the thing about sort of how many people worked in agriculture, 100 years ago. It was sort of something like 200 times what it is now, and how that has been automated. So it sort of creeps up on you, and that's sort of what I would call the future of no work, as we sort of as things get automated. And look, in 50 years, when my kids and grandkids are there, I think, and we see the way hours are reducing, we're working less and that type of thing. So this is going to become like really a sort of an everyday thing, and we've seen it. And the real challenge is, I think, with people, we've seen lots of senior people come into Turas Nua with, who've been on high salaries, and it I think it affects them sort of mentally, from a mental health perspective, the most. It's that move from a sort of a safe environment to a real challenge, and it can be difficult. And I think governments and society is really going to have to start thinking about that. And as we move along, as I said, it's very much evolution, and it's sort of creeping up. As we talk about chatbots, like chatbots really weren't around probably 7 or 8 years ago, and they're taking over the jobs of call centers. You go on to most sort of insurance sites, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, organizations are now, a lot of them don't work very well. Some of them are okay, and but that change is happening, and really society and governments really have to have a think about how do we move, because we all talk about, oh yeah, we're all going to be working much more creatively, and we're all going to be working much more in our head and not manually, etc. But I don't think we've thought about, well, what's the effect that's going to have on the person itself, and how many people are really going to be left behind in that type of, because look, we see in the US the numbers, are that have been left behind, in the Rust Belt and that type of thing, so it's front and center, and I think COVID has probably been a bit of a wake up call on both for organizations, workers, and sort of governments.
I hope so. And just to kind of summarize for those listening, if this has engaged your brain to think about, what you could do to really take advantage of an untapped pool of talent, but also to think about what you need to do to actually make sure you're ready to bring in such talent. To Colin's point, it requires a different way of thinking about recruiting, different way of thinking about how you'll have someone in your business. But then also there's some things that are just the same. Like, you got to treat the person like a normal staff member, one of your team as well, which is really important. Colin, we've hit time, and I really appreciate your time on this. I likewise could talk about this topic. It's one I'm fascinated with. We've set up a couple of programs with Open Doors Initiative in Ireland, with National Industries for the Blind in the US, around taking folks from disadvantaged backgrounds and train them as recruiters, for example. And we're learning it's not just about the training, to your point. It's about building their confidence, the skills to then have someone help them advocate for roles and other things. It's more complex than just give someone the experience, but it's part of it, right? And there's more to it, and you have to be more mindful as an employer looking to hire individuals from different backgrounds, which is so true. Wonder if you wouldn't mind closing, Colin, with one last piece of advice. We ask every guest on the show, as you know, to leave with us one piece of advice they've either been given throughout their career by somebody else that resonated, or that they've managed to kind of garner themselves in their own experience that could be helpful for our audience. So what would that one piece of advice be from yourself?
So I think it's for, I suppose, the leaders and managers and anyone who's managing people around confidence. I think, and it, again, in that book I talked about, it came home to me that giving people confidence almost gives them a sort of almost a superpower, right? But on the other side, undermining confidence, it gives there's a feeling of power when you undermine someone and undermine their confidence. It's a sort of a natural thing that happens to you. You sort of go, oh, I'm in control here. You know what I mean? And I think if people can just in their everyday, when they think about if they're undermining people, it can sometimes actually feel good for you, and just to maybe step back. And it's a really negative thing that can sort of get out of control with leaders and managers. And I think if you're in an organization and you're seeing it happen around you with other people, I think because when we take confidence, I think, away from people, it can lead to destructive sort of, relationships and behaviors and that type of thing. And I know it's a bit of a cheesy one, but I think it's a really important thing if we all just took that every day and said, whoa, because it actually, you sort of, you take, and it can happen in a discussion about a project or about work or whatever, and you take a heavy hand, and you see by dismantling someone's sort of argument, how you put them, almost, we call it in Ireland, we put him in his place type of thing. It's not a nice thing, I think.
You're right. I see people do it often where someone's making a point, and one of the points they're making is slightly incorrect, and you leap on that. They're generally correct, but you want to point out that something they said is not correct. You undermine them, kills their confidence. And what does it gain? You get a little, I know more than them, I pointed out something, but it literally, nobody wins, and probably somebody loses massively. And it's a good reminder, Colin. Really appreciate that. I can thank you for taking time out of your trip to Italy to join us, rushing to get to the hotel to join us with a carpet on your roof, as you pointed out as well, which is only in Italy, only near Florence. Colin, dying to have you on again to get your updates on many other topics. I know you come from a background of rich knowledge in many, many areas. And as you say, FRS is involved in many businesses. If anyone wants to get in touch with Turas Nua in Ireland, if anyone's listening who's interested in hiring from that market, what's the best way to reach out?
Just go to turasnua.ie, TURAS Nua NUA.ie, and on the employer side of, or any partners, anyone looking to partner with us and that type of thing. And just listen, a shout out to yourselves, Johnny, in Social Talent. We've been working with you for a long time. I remember you doing the sort of face-to-face stuff and turning it into a fantastic sort of online training resource for us in FRS, and it's actually just been great to work with you in terms of the support you give us personally, and coming along to sort of events and just shout outs, and I think the recruitment sector is a better place for you being in it, man. So well done.
Thank you. Really appreciate that, and thanks for supporting us all through these years. we'll stop with our mutual love. And listen, wish you a safe trip back home.
Cool.
Watch out for the girl coronavirus, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks a million, Johnny. See you later.
And thank you for listening. Come back next week for show 78. Next week, we're going to be having another good friend of social talent and ours, and mine in particular, Robbie McGillick-Podrick, who is the founder of the Talent Summit here in Ireland, and the CCO of Sigma Recruitment. And Robbie's going to share his insights on how to attract and retain tomorrow's talent. So sticking with a similar theme, Robbie's been working with tons of thought leaders, employers around the world in the Talent Summit that he's brought to the biggest talent conference here in Ireland over the last 5 years or so, and runs one of the biggest recruitment agencies in Ireland that's growing like crazy and has tons of insights to give us there. So join us next week. That's Wednesday, 1st of December, first of the December season, and that's going to be usual time, 4 p.m. UK Ireland, which is 11 a.m. the East Coast and 8 a.m. the West Coast of the US as well for that show. And don't forget, you can find out more about all of our shows and find links to the podcast, links to the previous shows and upcoming shows by going to socialtalent.com/the shortlist. And thanks to those of you listening live with your comments as well. We'll see you next week.